Before you watch this, I need you to understand something. Every single person at that rodeo ran. The experienced hands ran. The old-timers who'd worked cattle their whole lives, they ran. The ranch foreman, a man who'd broken horses since before I was born, he climbed the fence so fast he left a boot behind in the dirt. But one man didn't move. Not because he was brave, not because he was stupid, not because he didn't see the 1,200-pound bull named Perdición charging across that arena with blood in his eyes and foam on his jaw. He didn't move because he saw something the rest of us missed entirely. And what he saw, what he did next, is something I've spent 11 years trying to explain to people, and I still don't have words clean enough to carry it. This is the story of Tomás Redhorse, a poor cowboy from the edge of the Jicarilla Apache reservation. A man who owned one good rope, one cracked saddle, and a way of reading living things that I have never witnessed in another human being. Some men are afraid of what they don't understand. Tomás was afraid of almost nothing because he understood almost everything. What follows happened on a Thursday in late September, on a ranch outside Tierra Amarilla, New Mexico, in the year I turned 32 and stopped thinking I knew anything about courage. I keep a field journal. I know how that sounds. I'm not a scientist, not a ranger, not anyone with credentials worth listing on a business card. I'm a ranch hand turned livestock broker turned something I don't have a clean title for, a man who travels between operations in the high desert of New Mexico and southern Colorado, watching how animals move, how men handle them, and occasionally writing it down in a spiral notebook I buy 3 at a time from the drugstore in Chama. My handwriting is terrible. My spelling is worse. But I write things down because otherwise I forget them, and some things deserve to not be forgotten. The entry I made for September 22nd, 2013, is the longest in any journal I've kept. It takes up most of the notebook. There are places where the pen pressed so hard it tore through the page. I'd come to the Manzano ranch on borrowed time, and a contract that barely covered my fuel. Del Manzano, Delbert, though he hated that name and would stare at you with flat gray eyes if you used it, had called me 3 weeks prior asking if I knew anything about Brahma-Cross bulls that were, and I'm quoting him directly here, acting peculiar. Del was a man of limited vocabulary and unlimited certainty about most things, so when he admitted something was peculiar, I paid attention. Peculiar how? I asked. He stops, Del said. Bulls stop. Not like this, he stops and then he watches, just watches, and the other cattle won't go near him, my dogs won't go near him. My best hand walked into that pen 3 weeks ago and hasn't been right since. I asked what not right meant. Del was quiet for a moment, flinches at loud noises, wakes up at night. Quit smoking, which sounds fine except he replaced it with chewing on his knuckle. I drove up the following Monday. Perdición, that was the bull's registered name, and whoever at the breeding operation had named him had either remarkable foresight or a dark sense of humor, was a Brahma-Angus cross, somewhere between 7 and 8 years old, and approximately the color of old pewter with a dark stripe running from the crown of his hump down to his tail. He had the characteristic Brahma dewlap, heavy and pendulous, and ears that hung wider than his face when relaxed. His horns had been tipped but not removed, and they still curved outward with enough authority to command respect. He was in a pen by himself when I arrived. The other cattle, 15 Herefords and a handful of commercial crossbreeds, were in the adjacent pasture, pressed as far from the shared fence line as the acreage allowed. Not grazing, just standing there, facing away from Perdición's pen the way cattle do when something has disturbed the equilibrium of their world. I stood at the fence and watched him for a while. He watched me back. That was the thing Del had been trying to describe, and I understood immediately why the vocabulary had failed him. It wasn't the look of a dangerous animal assessing a threat. It wasn't dull bovine blankness either. It was, and I know this sounds like I'm reaching, it was attention. Focused, specific, patient attention, like he was waiting for me to do or say something that would clarify who I was. I didn't move, I didn't speak. He stood at the far end of the pen for maybe 4 minutes, and then he walked, not charged, walked to within about 15 feet of the fence and stopped again. Then he looked away, toward the mountains, and that was that. I wrote in my journal that night, either this animal has a neurological condition or he is smarter than any bull I have met. Possibly both. Del's hand is probably fine, probably. I spent 2 days watching Perdición before I saw Tomás Redhorse for the first time. He arrived on a Wednesday morning in a truck that had started life as a white Ford F-150 sometime in the mid-90s, and had since been transformed by weather, work, and apparent indifference into something closer to rust-colored sculpture. The passenger door didn't open from the outside. The bed held a spare tire, 2 coils of rope, a blue plastic tarp that had been folded and unfolded enough times to have permanent creases in a grid pattern, and a single cardboard box that I later learned contained, among other things, 3 books on animal behavior, a jar of pine pitch salve his grandmother had made, and a hand-drawn map of every watering hole within 40 miles. He was 34, though he looked both older and younger than that depending on the angle and the light. Apache on his father's side, he Korea, from the reservation northeast of the ranch, and the kind of lean that comes from physical work rather than deprivation, though I later learned it had been both at different periods of his life. He had a quality that I spent the better part of 2 days trying to name before I settled on stillness. Not passivity, not disengagement. An active, deliberate stillness, like a man who had learned somewhere that the world gave up more of its secrets to the patient watcher than to the one who went out demanding them. Dell introduced us with the brevity of a man who considered social niceties a tax on his time. Tomás knows cattle, he said. Knows some other things too. Let him look at the bull. Tomás didn't shake my hand immediately. He looked at me first, the same quality of look I'd seen from Perdición, which unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. And then he extended his hand and shook mine once firmly, without the performative pumping some men do to establish something. "You've been watching him," he said. It wasn't a question. 2 days, I said. "What did you see?" I told him. The attention, the approach, the way the other cattle pressed away from the fence. The stillness that matched his own, actually, though I didn't say that part. He listened without nodding, without any of the small social affirmations people usually perform to signal they're following along. He just listened. And when I finished, he said, "What did you smell?" I blinked, "Excuse me." When he walked up to the fence, "What did you smell?" I thought about it. I hadn't thought about it in those terms. "Dust," I said, "and something, I don't know, metallic maybe, like pennies." Tomás nodded slowly. "Blood," he said. "Not recent, old blood. He's been injured somewhere, internal probably, and it's been going long enough to be chronic." He paused. "He's in pain. He's been in pain for a while. The watching, that's what pain does to an animal that's intelligent enough to process it. Makes them careful, makes them look for the source." I stared at him. "You got all that from you describing what you saw." He looked toward the pen. "I'll look at him myself now." What Tomás did over the next hour, I documented as carefully as I could, though my notes from that period are messy because I was writing while watching and couldn't bring myself to look away long enough to write clean sentences. He didn't approach the pen directly. He walked to a spot maybe 30 yards away and crouched down, not sat, crouched on the balls of his feet, the way you do when you're prepared to move quickly in any direction, and he stayed there. Perdición was at the far end of the pen. For 10 minutes, nothing happened. Then Perdición turned his head. He looked at Tomás. Tomás didn't look away, but he also didn't hold the eye contact in the challenging way that reads as aggression to cattle. He looked at a point just beside the bull's face, which is a technique I'd read about but never seen executed with that kind of patience. Another 5 minutes. Perdición took 3 steps toward him and stopped. Tomás made a sound I couldn't identify from where I was standing. Low, not quite a hum, not quite a word. Something in between that seemed to belong to a register of communication I didn't have access to. The bull's ears moved. Not the alarmed swivel of an animal startled, a slower rotation, like a satellite dish adjusting. Tomás made the sound again. Over the following 40 minutes, Perdición walked, always walked, never rushed to within 12 feet of the fence. Tomás never stood up from his crouch. His knees must have been screaming at him, but he didn't shift, didn't redistribute his weight visibly, just stayed there in that position like he'd been built for it. When Perdición finally stopped and looked away, the same dismissal I'd gotten on my first day, Tomás stood up slowly, turned around, and walked back to where I was standing. "How bad is it?" I asked. I meant the injury. "Bad enough," he said, "but that's not the main problem." "What is?" He looked at me in that measuring way again. The main problem is that everyone who comes near him is afraid of him, and he can tell. And an animal in pain, surrounded by fear, eventually he becomes what everyone expects him to be. I wrote that down that night, word for word. Dell's plan, which he announced at dinner that evening with the settled confidence of a man announcing weather, was to run Perdición in the arena the following weekend. Not a rodeo exactly, just a local gathering of ranch hands and neighbors that happened every fall on his property. Part cattle evaluation, part social event, part opportunity for men to prove things to each other and to themselves. Perdición was, according to Dell's accounting, the most expensive animal on the property and therefore needed to demonstrate value. If he couldn't be worked, he'd be sold. If he couldn't be sold in good conscience, he'd be processed. Tomás said nothing during this announcement. I watched his face and saw nothing either, which was itself a kind of statement. Later outside, I found him sitting on the tailgate of his truck, looking at the mountains going dark against a sky that had turned the color of a bruise at the western edge. "You disagree with him," I said. "It doesn't matter what I disagree with," he said. "It's his ranch and his bull." But, a long pause, "But you don't put an animal in pain in front of a crowd to prove a point. You're not proving anything except that you can make a suffering thing suffer more." I asked him how he'd come to work for Dell, if that's what you'd call it. The arrangement seemed loose. Tomás had been called in as a kind of last resort, the way you call a specialist after the general practitioners have shrugged. He was known in the region, it turned out, for exactly this. Animals that other people couldn't handle, couldn't read, couldn't reach. Horses that had gone mean from abuse. Dogs that had lost themselves in trauma. Cattle that had developed what the old ranchers called a bad head. The untranslatable thing that happened when an animal's experience of the world had bent something essential in them. He'd grown up on the reservation, he told me, not volunteering much but answering what I asked. His grandfather had kept cattle before the economics of it became impossible. His father had worked rodeos, not as a competitor but as a hand, one of the invisible men who kept the machinery running. Tomás had followed him into that world as a teenager and left it in his early 20s, after something happened that he didn't describe and I didn't press about. After that, he'd worked ranches, learned things, and developed a reputation that traveled the way useful reputations do, by word of mouth, by one desperate phone call to someone who'd gotten a desperate phone call. "Do you want to go back home?" I asked. He looked at me. "I am home," he said, and gestured at the landscape in a way that seemed to encompass all of it, the mountains, the high desert plateau, the dark smell of juniper coming down from the hills, rather than any specific place within it. I slept badly that night. I have a habit when I can't sleep, of reading back through my older journals. I don't know why, it doesn't usually help, and sometimes it makes things worse by reminding me of things I'd rather not think about. But that night I found myself reading an entry from about 4 years prior, from a ranch in Colorado where I'd watched a horse get destroyed because nobody could figure out what was wrong with it, and the owner ran out of patience before the answer arrived. The horse had been in pain too. Nobody had smelled it. I closed the journal and lay there in the dark, listening to the wind come down off the Sangre de Cristos, and thought about what Tomás had said. An animal in pain, surrounded by fear, eventually becomes what everyone expects him to be. I thought about how that sentence didn't only apply to animals. I wrote that in the margin of my journal the next morning, in smaller handwriting than usual, like I didn't quite want to commit to it. The days before the gathering were quiet but not peaceful. Tomás spent most of each day near Perdición's pen, sometimes crouching in his watching position, sometimes sitting against a fence post 30 yards away reading one of his books, sometimes just walking a slow perimeter around the property as if mapping it with his feet. He didn't attempt to enter the pen. He didn't rush anything. Dell watched this with thinly concealed impatience. "He doing anything?" he asked me on Thursday as if I were Tomás's interpreter. "He's watching him," I said. "I can see he's watching him. I'm asking if he's doing anything." "That's what he does," I said. "That's the thing." Dell made a sound somewhere between a grunt and a sigh, and walked away. I found myself in the uncomfortable position of believing in something I couldn't explain clearly to anyone else, which is a position I'm familiar with from childhood and adolescence and several failed relationships, but which feels particularly acute when the stakes are an animal's life. On Friday evening, Tomás entered the pen. He didn't tell me he was going to. I happened to be coming back from the equipment barn and saw the gate swinging closed behind him. I stopped walking. Perdición was at the far end of the pen, which was maybe 80 feet across. He turned at the sound of the gate and faced Tomás, and for a moment the geometry of it was simple and terrible. 1,200 pounds of injured, pain-sensitized bull and one lean man with no barrier between them. Tomás stood still. He made the sound, that low not-quite hum. Perdición's ears rotated. 20 minutes later, Tomás was standing 6 feet from the bull, his hand resting on the animal's neck, and Perdición was making a sound I had never heard a bull make, low, rhythmic, almost like a cat's purr run through a much larger instrument. Not contentment, exactly. Something closer to relief. I wrote in my journal, I don't know what I'm watching, I don't know what language this is, but it is a language. Tomás came out of the pen a half-hour later. His shirt had a smear of mud on one shoulder where Perdición had pressed his head against him. He let you touch him, I said. He needed someone to touch him without being afraid, Tomás said. That's all. Saturday came with the kind of New Mexico sky that seems specifically designed to make everything below it feel small, pure blue from horizon to horizon, the mountains sharp-edged as cut paper, the light falling at angles that made every shadow a precise geometry. By 9 in the morning there were trucks parked along the fence line and men with coffee cups standing in groups, doing the slow social mathematics of who knew whom and what everyone was worth. I noticed something I should have anticipated but somehow hadn't. When people learned that Perdición was going to be run in the arena, their reaction was not the wariness I'd been living with for a week. Their reaction was interest, the kind of interest that has a slightly sharp edge to it. The kind that shows up at the end of a long week, when men who work hard and dangerous jobs find their way to something that might go wrong in a way that provides them with something to talk about afterward. Someone had heard about the bull. Someone else had heard about the hand who developed a flinch. The story had grown the way stories do in small communities, not with malicious embellishment, necessarily, but with the natural expansion of a thing that passes through multiple mouths before it reaches you. By the time the gathering was in full swing, Perdición had acquired a reputation. Del didn't correct it. Del, I realized, had maybe cultivated it, not cruelly, but practically. A famous bull was worth more than an obscure one. A bull with a story was worth more than a bull without one. Tomás had been quiet all morning. He'd eaten breakfast alone at the tailgate of his truck. I'd brought him a plate from the main table, which he'd accepted without comment, and then returned to his position near the pen. He hadn't entered it again. Perdición had come to the fence line twice, and each time Tomás had made the low sound and the bull had settled. Around 11 o'clock, Del came to find us both. We're going to run him at 2, Del said. Tomás looked at him. What does that mean, run him? Put him in the arena, let people see what he does. And if what he does is hurt someone. That's what the fence is for, Del said. A pause. He's not going to perform, Tomás said. He's not a performance animal. He's a working bull with a chronic injury who's been isolated for weeks. What you'll see in that arena is what pain looks like when it gets out. Del's jaw set. I've made my decision. I know, Tomás said. I'm not arguing with your decision. I'm telling you what's going to happen. Del walked away. I looked at Tomás. His face was quiet, but there was something happening behind it, something being calculated or accepted or decided. I'd known him less than a week, and I already recognized the difference between his ordinary stillness and the stillness that preceded action. What are you going to do? I asked. He looked at me for a moment. Write it down, he said, whatever happens. Write it down. I didn't know what to say to that, so I opened my journal and wrote, 2 hours to the arena. Tomás told me to write it down. I don't know yet what that means. The arena was a working structure, not a rodeo setup, but a solid rectangle of 6-rail fence with a gate at each end, built for the practical work of sorting and loading cattle rather than spectacle. It held maybe 30 people comfortably along the rails. By 1:30, there were closer to 50, with the overflow sitting on truck hoods and fence posts and folding chairs dragged from the barn. I found a spot at the corner of the arena where I could see the whole rectangle. I had my journal open. I was already writing before anything started, which is what I do when I'm nervous. I described the crowd, the sky, the smell of dust and coffee and engine oil, the way the mountains looked from that angle in that light. I described the gate at the far end where Perdición would enter. I described the gate near me where I knew the men would exit if things went wrong. At 2 o'clock, Dell nodded to the hand operating the far gate. The gate swung open. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Perdición walked into the arena. He was magnificent, and he was wrong, and those two things occupied the same space simultaneously, the way all tragic things do. He walked in and stopped and looked at the crowd, and every person along that fence went quiet. Not from awe, from something older than awe. From the animal part of us that recognizes what the rest of us spends its whole life pretending not to. Perdición looked at the crowd for a long moment. Then he looked at Tomás. I don't know if I can explain what happened in the next 3 seconds. I'm not sure the journal entry I made right afterward fully captures it. But Tomás was standing at the rail, not gripping it, just standing with his hands loose at his sides, and when the bull's eyes found him, something in the bull's posture changed, not relaxed exactly, but oriented, the way a compass needle swings. Then someone's coffee thermos fell off a fence rail and hit the ground with a sound like a gunshot. I'm going to try to describe what happened in the next 4 minutes accurately, which means I'm going to resist the temptation to make it more dramatic than it was and more coherent than it was, because the truth of it is that it was both very dramatic and very incoherent in the way that real things are when they're moving faster than your ability to process them. The thermos hit the ground. Perdición charged. Not at Tomás at the sound. He crossed the arena in a diagonal that took him toward the north fence where the thermos had fallen, and he covered maybe 40 feet in the kind of time that resets your understanding of what 1,200 pounds can do when it has 4 legs and a reason. The crowd at that section of fence didn't exactly scatter. They didn't have time to scatter. They just compressed backward and upward, men climbing rails with a speed that had nothing to do with planning and everything to do with instinct. The bull hit the fence. Not full impact, a glancing blow, shoulder into the second rail, enough to shudder the whole structure and produce a sound like a rifle crack. He bounced off it, pivoted, and that pivot was where you understood something about the animal's intelligence, because he didn't continue to charge in the direction of his momentum. He redirected, reoriented, and the crowd along the fence line became a ripple of bodies moving back and away as his attention swept across them. Everyone ran. I mean everyone. Dell's foreman, a man named Gutierrez who had been working cattle for 30 years and had the hands to prove it, cleared the fence in one motion without apparent effort. 3 men who had been sitting on truck hoods dropped off the far side. 2 hands who had positioned themselves inside the arena for some reason I never determined were suddenly no longer inside the arena. I gripped the fence rail in front of me and stood still. Not from bravery, from a kind of paralysis that I refuse to call bravery even now, 11 years later, because bravery implies a choice, and what I experienced was closer to the temporary cessation of any decision-making capacity. I was frozen. My pen was in my hand, and my journal was open, and I was frozen. Tomás did not run. He was 12 feet from me along the rail, and he hadn't moved. His hands were still loose. His weight was still even. He was watching the bull the way you watch something you're not afraid of, which made no physical sense given what was happening 3 feet in front of us. Perdición turned toward him. The bull was blowing hard, sides heaving, and there was something in his eyes that I can only describe as catastrophic confusion. An animal in pain who had responded to a threat stimulus, and now could not locate the source of the threat, surrounded by the smell of human fear on all sides, alone in the middle of an arena with a crowd of terrified people pressing against the fence and one man who was not terrified. That one man was looking at him the way you look at someone you know. What Tomás did next, I watched and wrote down simultaneously, which means I missed some of it and got some of it wrong, and I've corrected and recorrected this account over the years until I think I have it close. He didn't move toward the bull. He moved down. He crouched that same crouch, balls of his feet, weight forward but balanced, and he made the sound. Right there in the arena, with Perdición maybe 30 feet away and still moving, still blowing, still in whatever state comes after the charge and before the next decision. He made the low, not quite hum sound, and he stayed crouched and he waited. I could hear the crowd. Not voices exactly. just the compressed noise of 50 people trying to be very still and very small simultaneously, which has its own particular quality. A held breath sound, a collective suspension. Perdición stopped moving. He was facing Tomás. His head was low, lower than normal rest position, which is a specific signal if you know cattle, though I'm not sure everyone watching knew it, and I'm not sure I understood it fully until Tomás explained it to me later. Head low in a bull can mean aggression, but it can also mean exhaustion. It can mean pain. It can mean I am not sure what to do next in the grammar of the animal. Tomás made the sound again. The bull's ears moved. 20 seconds, 30, 45. The bull took a step toward him. One step, stopped, evaluated. Another step. I wrote in my journal, in handwriting that I can still read, but barely. He's going to walk to him. I think he's going to walk to him. 15 feet. 10. At 8 feet, the bull stopped and his head came up slightly, and I felt the crowd tighten again, that collective breath pulled back in. Tomás held the sound, held it like a note, steady, not increasing in volume or urgency. And after a moment that lasted about 3 years in subjective time, Perdición's head dropped again. He walked to Tomás. Not slowly, not cautiously, just walked, the way you walk toward something familiar, the way you walk toward water. Tomás put his hand on the animal's jaw, not the neck this time, but the jaw, which is a more intimate contact, more exposed, more vulnerable, the place where a sudden movement could take your hand off. He held his hand there and looked at the bull's eye, which was now level with his crouching face. What I saw in the bull's eye from 30 feet away was not nothing. I need to be careful about this because I know how it sounds, and I know the limits of what human perception can accurately decode from an animal's eye. But there was something there that had not been there during the charge. Something that read, in the inadequate language I have for it, as arrival. As the end of a journey the animal hadn't known it was making. The crowd didn't make a sound. Not because they were still afraid, because they understood they were seeing something and they didn't want to interrupt it. Del let the moment go for about 3 minutes before he walked back into the arena. He walked carefully, slowly, the way you walk near sleeping dogs, and he came to stand beside me rather than approaching Tomás or the bull. His face was doing something complicated. Del's face didn't usually do complicated things. He had the kind of expression that either communicated approval or disapproval with the efficiency of a traffic light. What I saw now was somewhere in between and edged with something I hadn't expected from him. "How is he doing that?" Del said quietly, not a challenge, a genuine question. "I don't entirely know," I said. "He's not afraid." "No." Del was quiet for a moment. "The bull can tell." "Yes." Another silence. "My granddad used to say the cattle always know," Del said. "Couldn't explain it either." I didn't say anything. I wrote it down. Tomás spent another 20 minutes in the arena before he guided, not led, guided. The distinction matters, Perdición back to the gate. He walked beside the bull, not in front or behind, and the bull walked with him the way a dog walks with someone it has decided to trust. The crowd parted at the gate without being asked. Del closed it behind them. In the silence that followed, no one moved for a moment. And then Gutierrez, the foreman with the 30 years and the weathered hands, started clapping. Not the enthusiastic clapping of a performance. The slow, deliberate kind that means something different. That means I witnessed this, and I want you to know I witnessed it. Others joined. Tomás didn't turn around. He was already walking back toward his truck. I caught up with him at the tailgate. He was sitting down, drinking from a metal water bottle, and his hands were shaking. Not badly, not in a way that anyone else would notice, probably. But I noticed because I was standing right there, and I was watching him the way I'd been watching everyone else all week, and the shaking was real. "You were scared," I said. He looked at me. "Of course I was scared," he said. "I had not expected that." "You didn't look scared." "Looking scared and being scared are different things," he said. He needed someone who didn't look scared. That's the work. The being scared part, that happens after. He took another drink of water. "Your hands are shaking," I said. "I know," he said. "Give it a minute." I gave him a minute. I gave him several minutes. I walked away and stood by my own truck and looked at the mountains and thought about what he just said. And then I went back and found him in the same position, hands steadier now, eyes on the pen where Perdición had returned to his position at the far end. "What did you see?" I asked him. "Before you went in, before the thermos fell, what did you see that made you stay?" He was quiet long enough that I thought he might not answer. "The way he entered," he said finally. "Most dangerous animals, when they enter an unfamiliar space, they scan for exits first. Prey behavior. He didn't do that. He came in and he looked at the people, not to assess threat, to find something." "Find what?" "Someone who wasn't afraid of him. I absorbed this. He was looking for you." "He was looking for anyone." A pause. "I happened to be the one." Dell found us there about 20 minutes later. He had 2 cups of coffee, which was the closest thing to a formal piece offering his personality aloud, and he handed one to Tomás without preamble and stood there holding the other. "I owe you an apology," Dell said. Tomás looked at him. "I ran him knowing it wasn't right," Dell said. "I wanted to see what he'd do. I wanted," he paused, working at the words, "I wanted to know if he was what I was afraid he was." And Tomás said, "He's not," Dell looked at the pen. "He's something else." Another pause. "I don't know what to do with that." "Yes, you do," Tomás said. Dell looked at him. "You have to treat him differently," Tomás said. "That's all. He's not dangerous. He's in pain and he's been afraid, and he needs those 2 things addressed. If you do that, you'll have the best working bull on this property." "And if I don't?" Tomás held his gaze. "You already know what happens if you don't." Dell drank his coffee, nodded once, walked away. That evening, the gathering wound down the way these things do, slowly, incrementally, trucks pulling out one by one until the property went quiet except for the animals and the wind. I stayed, because I didn't have anywhere to be until Monday, and because I wanted to keep writing. Tomás stayed too, though I don't think it was by plan. We ended up sitting outside after dark, which in high desert New Mexico in late September means sitting under a sky so crowded with stars that it feels aggressive, like the universe is insisting on itself. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees from the afternoon. We had a small fire going from scraps of wood I'd found near the equipment barn. I asked him something I'd been circling all day. "When you were in there," I said, "the moment after the thermos fell, you had maybe half a second to decide to stay or go. What happened in that half second?" He thought about it, not performing thought, actually thinking. "I saw his eyes," he said. "The moment the sound happened, and what I saw it wasn't rage, it wasn't aggression. It was exactly what panic looks like. I've seen it 100 times. I've probably felt it myself about that many times. Panic. Something loud and unexpected in a place where you're already in pain and already scared. Your body reacts before your mind does. The charge wasn't an attack, it was a flinch." He paused. "You don't run from a flinch." I wrote that down. "But you couldn't be sure," I said. "In the moment, you couldn't be sure that's what it was." "No," he said. "I couldn't be sure." He poked at the fire with a stick, and the sparks went up and mixed with the stars. And in the silence that followed, I heard the distant sound of Perdición moving in his pen, not a distressed sound, just the ordinary sound of a large animal settling. "Were you sure," I asked, "before the arena, when you convinced yourself to stay?" He looked at me. "I wasn't convincing myself of anything. I made an assessment and I acted on it. The assessment could have been wrong." "But it wasn't." "This time," he said. "The ones where the assessment was wrong, I'm not here anymore to talk about those." I looked at him. "I've been hurt," he said matter-of-factly, "more than once. Part of this work is accepting that sometimes you'll read something wrong and you'll pay for it. The alternative is to stop trusting what you see. And if you stop trusting what you see," he left it unfinished. "You become afraid," I said. "You become useless," he said, "which is worse." Late that night, past midnight, fire down to coals, he told me about the thing with his father. Not the full thing, I don't think the full thing has a telling, but enough. His father had worked rodeos. Had worked them well and without complaint for years, in the way that the invisible men who keep those machines running work, competently, quietly, with skill that nobody names because naming it would require acknowledging it. His father had also, in those years, developed an understanding of the animals that went beyond what the job required. He could read a horse in the chute before anyone else knew it was going to blow. He could tell from 20 feet which bull was going to turn when it exited the gate. He'd tried to tell people. The people in charge of deciding things had not, generally, been interested in what the pen man thought. One afternoon, his father had seen something in a horse in the chute that he knew meant trouble, and he'd said so, and the rider had gone anyway, and the horse had done exactly what his father had said it would do, and the rider had been badly hurt, and afterward his father had been let go from that rodeo. Not because he'd been wrong. Because he'd been right in a way that made the people in charge uncomfortable. Tomás had been 17. He'd watched his father clear out a locker in 20 minutes and load his truck and drive away without saying much. He wasn't angry, Tomás said. I kept waiting for him to be angry. He never was. What was he? Tired, Tomás said. Not from the work, tired from the part before the work, the part where you have to convince people that what you see is real. He was quiet after that for a while. Is that why you do this? I asked eventually. The animals, the work. He thought about it. Animals don't need convincing, he said. They either respond to you or they don't. There's no arguing about what's real. I sat with that. And people, I asked. He smiled slightly for the first time in 2 days. People need more convincing, he said. But today some of them saw it themselves. He looked up at the stars. That's enough, he said. That's enough for today. I wrote for 2 hours after he went to sleep in his truck. I wrote about his father and about the horse in the chute and about the way inheritance works. Not the clean, declarable inheritance of property, but the other kind, the kind that passes through watching and suffering and deciding what to do with what you've seen. I wrote about Dell and his apology, which had been imperfect and incomplete and entirely genuine, all 3 of those things simultaneously, and about Gutierrez starting the slow clapping, and about what it meant that 50 people had stood at a fence and witnessed something that rearranged, at least temporarily, some of their fixed ideas. I wrote about Perdición, who was sleeping now in his pen, making the ordinary sounds of a large animal at rest, and who had walked toward the one person who wasn't afraid of him with the urgency of a thing that had been waiting a long time for exactly that. I wrote the bull was never the problem. The bull was the symptom. The problem was that nobody stayed long enough to find out why. Then I crossed that out and wrote it again, because it seemed important to commit to it. This was unusual enough that I pulled over when I saw his name on my phone, because Dell did not call people unnecessarily, and had, in the 6 or 7 years of our professional acquaintance, called me exactly 4 times prior to the Perdición situation. He was a man who communicated through scarcity. You felt the weight of his attention precisely because he distributed it so sparingly. Perdición's better, he said without preamble. Better how? I asked. Not limping anymore. Veterinarian found a hairline in his left front hoof, old injury, grown over wrong, probably happened 18 months ago at the property before mine. We had it treated. A pause. He's eating properly now, gaining weight. That's good, I said. He worked cattle last week, Dell said. Gutierrez ran him with the herd, no issues. Animals aren't pressing against the fence anymore. Another pause, longer this time. He's a good bull. Yes, I said. I wanted you to know, Dell said, and then because he was Dell, tell Redhorse. He hung up. I'd kept in touch with Tomás in the weeks since the gathering, not frequently, because neither of us was a frequent communicator, but in the occasional text message exchange that served as a kind of low-maintenance thread between 2 people who had witnessed something together and weren't quite done with it. I told him what Dell had said. He responded 2 hours later, good. Then, after a pause, hoof injuries are common in animals that have been moved too often. They absorb it and compensate until they can't. I wrote that in the margin of my journal next to the entry from the day I'd arrived at the ranch. Then he sent, "How are you doing?" which surprised me, in the specific way that an unexpected question surprises you by revealing that you hadn't been asking it yourself. I thought about it honestly and wrote back, better than I was before I drove up there, not sure what that means. He sent, "It means you saw something real. That usually helps." I want to try to describe something that I've been circling around through these pages and haven't approached directly, because it's the part I'm least certain about and the most certain I need to get right. In the weeks following the gathering at Dell's ranch, I found myself thinking about what Tomás had done in the arena in a different context than the one it had happened in. The context wasn't cattle or animals or the specific situation of a dangerous bull and a frightened crowd. The context was the more general question of what happens when someone remains present in a moment that everyone around them is fleeing. I'm going to be precise here. I don't think the lesson of what happened at that arena is that bravery is the absence of fear. Tomás was afraid. He said so. His hands proved it. The lesson is something more specific and harder to translate. That sometimes remaining present in a situation that everyone else has decided to leave is not a statement about your own fearlessness. It's a statement about what you see that they don't. What Tomás saw was panic. What everyone else saw was danger. They aren't incompatible. Panic is dangerous, but they require different responses. You respond to danger by removing yourself from it. You respond to panic by staying, by offering steadiness to the thing that has lost it, by refusing to add your own fear to the total amount of fear already present in the situation. The crowd's collective exit added to Perdición's panic. Their running confirmed for him that the thing he was afraid of was real and present and terrible, because animals read the behavior of other animals as data, as information about the actual state of the world. When everything runs, it means the thing that's coming is real. When everything runs except one, when one stays steady, making a sound that cuts through the noise, the data changes. The one who stays becomes the anchor. What Tomás understood, from watching and from his father's example and from years of this specific work, is that being the anchor is possible even when you're afraid. That the feeling in your body and the behavior you choose are separable. That the fear goes in your hands afterward, when it's safe to let it, and in the moment you make a different choice, not because the fear isn't real, but because you've decided what matters more than the fear. I wrote several drafts of this analysis in my journal over those weeks. Most of them I crossed out because they felt too tidy, too lesson-shaped, too like the kind of thing you put on a poster rather than the kind of thing you actually live. What I kept was simpler. I wrote he decided what the bull needed was more important than what he was feeling. That's not bravery. I don't know what to call it. Maybe that's the right word after all, and I just didn't understand it before. In November, Tomás called me. Not a text, an actual call, which in our communication pattern carried its own significance. There's a situation up in Colorado, he said. Horse operation outside of Durango. Owner is thinking about putting down 3 horses that he can't handle and can't sell in good conscience. Wants someone to come look before he makes the decision. You're calling to let me know, I said. I'm calling to ask if you want to come. I was quiet for a moment. I'm not sure what I add, I said honestly. You watch, he said, and you write it down, that's not nothing. I drove up to Durango on a Thursday, which is becoming a significant day in my personal mythology, given that the gathering at Dell's ranch had also been a Thursday. I am not a superstitious person in the formal sense, but I write down patterns because patterns are the only thing that makes the chaos legible. The horse operation was owned by a man named Clifford Yazzie, who was Navajo from Window Rock and had relocated to southern Colorado 15 years ago to work with quarter horses. He was approximately 60, with the particular quality of physical confidence that comes from a lifetime of working with large animals, a sense of knowing exactly where his body was in space relative to any other body, the unconscious precision of someone who has spent decades navigating environments where inaccurate proprioception has real consequences. 3 of his horses, a mare named CeeLo, an older gelding named Frank who had come from a racing background, and a young stallion with no name yet because Clifford hadn't gotten close enough to name him properly, had been in an adjacent barn for 6 weeks following what Clifford described carefully as a situation involving a previous handler that I won't characterize because I don't have direct knowledge of it, only the outcome. The outcome was 3 horses that flinched at raised hands. I won't give this situation the detailed account I gave the one at Dell's ranch, for several reasons. First, because it's Clifford's story more than mine and I don't have the right to tell all of it. Second, because what happened over the 3 days Tomás and I spent in Durango was slower and quieter than what happened in that arena, and some of its meaning lives precisely in the slowness and the quiet, which resist being translated into the kind of account that holds attention. What I'll say is this. On the first day, Tomás did not approach the horses. He sat in the barn's alleyway and read and occasionally made sounds and let them hear him exist. On the second day, he sat closer. Frank, the old gelding, came to the gate of his stall and looked at him for a long time. Tomás looked back. Neither offered anything more. On the third day, Frank let Tomás touch his nose. The young stallion from across the barn watched this happen with the attention I had come to recognize as a specific kind of animal intelligence. Cataloging, filing, preparing for a future decision. Silo, the mare, didn't come to the gate at all. I asked Tomás about this on the drive back south, whether he was concerned. "She'll come," he said. "She's not ready yet, that doesn't mean she won't be." "How long As long as it takes," he said. "That's the only honest answer anyone can give you." "Clifford might not have that long," I said, "economically." Tomás was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "I told him I'd come back once a month as long as he needs, no charge until the horses are working." I looked at him. "That's not a sustainable arrangement." "No," he said. "It's not." "So why?" "Because they need time and he doesn't have money, and those two things are in conflict, and someone has to bridge the gap." He said this with the same matter-of-fact quality he brought to everything, like he was describing a logistics problem that had an obvious solution rather than a choice that was going to cost him something real. I wrote in my journal that night, he does this. He absorbs the gap between what the situation needs and what the resources allow. He's been doing it his whole life, probably. The gap between what he saw and what people would let him say, the gap between what his father knew and what the world would hear. He absorbs it without drama. I don't know if he knows how much that costs. We drove for a while in silence after that, the kind of silence that has texture, not uncomfortable, but full. The road south from Durango runs through canyon country before it opens up into the plateau, and in November the cottonwoods along the river were stripped bare, their white trunks bright in the flat afternoon light. I asked him something I'd been holding since September. "Your father," I said, "after the rodeo, did things get better for him?" He kept his eyes on the road. "Define better." "Did he find work, did he?" "He found work," Tomás said. "Different work. He spent a few years doing fence repair and irrigation work and things like that. He wasn't unhappy, he was practical." A pause. "He missed the animals, you could see it. When he was around them, even in passing, just working near a field, he was different. Lighter." "Did he ever go back to rodeo work?" "No." "Why not?" "Because he'd learned that the work he was good at wasn't valued enough to protect him from the people who decided what was valued." A pause. "He didn't say that. I'm saying it. He just didn't go back." "Is that why you went?" Silence. "I went because I was young and I thought I could do what he did and get different results," Tomás said. "That's a young person's logic." "And did you get different results?" He smiled slightly at the road. "I got different results in different ways than I expected." He paused. "Less rejection from the people in charge, more injuries from the animals, so it evens out." I laughed. I hadn't expected to laugh. He glanced at me, and there was something in his expression that I took a long time to understand, a kind of pleasure in the surprise of it, in having caused something lighter than the weight of what we'd been talking about. "You don't do that enough," he said. "Do what?" "That," he gestured vaguely at me. "Be less serious than you are." "I'm a man who keeps a field journal and drives around watching how animals move," I said. "How much less serious do you want me to be?" "Considerably," he said. I went back to Durango with him in December and in January. Silo came to the gate in January. It took 20 minutes of Tomás sitting on the floor of the barn alleyway in the cold, and it was the kind of 20 minutes that tests things in you that you thought were settled. But she came. She stood at the gate and looked at him and breathed in his direction, which for horses is a specific social behavior, an introduction, an acknowledgement, and Tomás breathed back, long and slow, and the mare's ears settled. Clifford watched this from the far end of the barn and said nothing. But when Tomás came out an hour later, Clifford shook his hand and held it for a moment, and that was its own language. "I need to go back to something. Back to September, to the arena, to the moment after Perdición walked to Tomás and the crowd went quiet. I've been thinking about what those people saw and what it did to them. Not the functional thing, the dangerous bull was calmed by skilled handler version, which is a real thing that happened and has a clean narrative shape, but the thing underneath that, the thing that made Gutierrez start that slow, deliberate clapping. I think what they saw was proof. Proof that their fear, the fear that had made them climb the fence, that had organized them all in a collective movement away from a central threat, had not been the only possible response. That there had been a different reading of the situation, available to the one person who had been equipped to make it, and that the different reading had led to a different outcome. This is uncomfortable to sit with if you're one of the people who ran. Not because running was wrong, running was the rational response to the available information, but because witnessing a better response reveals the limit of your own, and limits are uncomfortable to encounter, especially when you thought you knew what you were doing. I think that's why the applause was slow. It wasn't celebratory. It was respectful in the way that genuine reckoning with your own limits is, quietly, with effort, with a kind of honesty that costs something. And Tomás had walked away without turning around, which I think was the right thing, though I don't know if he knew it was the right thing or just didn't think about it. He had not accepted the applause as a verdict on anything. He just walked away, and his hands had been shaking, and he'd drunk water, and answered my questions and later told me about his father. He hadn't made it about himself. He'd kept his focus on what it was actually about, which was the animal and whether the animal was okay. That's the thing I keep coming back to. The difference between doing the right thing because it makes you the person who did the right thing and doing the right thing because the right thing needs doing. Those two motivations feel similar from the outside. They feel very different from the inside. Tomás had not needed the crowd to understand. He had needed the bull to understand. That was the distinction that changed how I thought about things for a long time afterward, and that still sits somewhere in the back of how I approach what I do and how I write about it. Spring came. I know that sounds like a scene transition in a movie, but that's what happened. The winter did its work, slow and cold, and full of the kind of small daily necessities that don't make it into journals but constitute most of an actual life. And then it was March, and I drove up to Dell's ranch for a routine broker visit and found Gutierrez working Perdición with the main herd in the north pasture. I pulled over and watched. The bull was moving with the herd, which sounds ordinary but wasn't. He was integrated in the way that healthy animals integrate, without the telling separations that injured or behaviorally compromised animals maintain. He was eating in close proximity to two Herefords. He wasn't watching the fence line. Gutierrez saw my truck and rode over. "How is he?" I asked. "He's good," Gutierrez said. He seemed to want to say more and not know how. He's a different animal." "Same animal," I said, "just a different situation." Gutierrez looked at me, nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said, "yeah, that's right." In May, Clifford called me to tell me that Frank, the old gelding, had been sold to a family in New Mexico who wanted him as a children's riding horse. He described the transaction with the careful neutrality of someone who had made a decision that was economically necessary and emotionally complicated, and had found a way to make peace with both of those things simultaneously. "He went a good people," Clifford said. "Kids can be rough, but these kids, I could see they'd be gentle." "How could you tell?" I asked. "They were gentle with each other," he said. "The kids, the way they talked to each other when they thought nobody was listening." A pause. "People are the same with animals as they are when they think nobody's watching, usually." I wrote that down. Then I asked him about CeeLo. "She's staying," he said. She'll probably never be a working horse, but she's okay, she's present." Another pause. "She comes to the fence now when I bring the coffee out in the mornings. She just stands there. I don't do anything, she doesn't do anything, He stopped. "I know," I said. "Yeah," he said. I drove up to see Tomás in June. He was at a property near Dulce, back on the reservation, more or less on a friend's land, working with a pair of cattle dogs that had, through circumstances I was told about gradually over 2 days, lost their working ability after a confrontation with a larger animal, and were now spending most of their time in the barn, as close to the back wall as they could get. It was quieter work than the bull, less dramatic, more painstaking. I sat in the barn and watched and wrote. In the evenings we cooked outside on a small propane stove and talked, and I asked him things I'd been saving for months, and he answered them in the deliberate way he answered most things, honestly, without performance, occasionally omitting things that I understood were his to keep. I asked him if he ever thought about doing something else. Like what? He said. I don't know. Something that doesn't involve being in spaces with hurt animals, and no guarantee you come out of it the same shape you went in. He stirred the pot for a while. I think about it, he said. Not as a real option, as an idea I visit sometimes. What do you see when you visit? Quiet, he said. A lot of quiet, no more shaking hands afterward. That sounds like giving up, he said. I know, he looked at the fire. I've earned some quiet, I know that too, but the quiet would be different than I imagine it, because the knowing doesn't go away. When you can read something, when you've spent your whole life learning to read something, you can't choose not to read it anymore. He paused. I'd see a lame horse in a field somewhere, and I'd see the field, and I'd see the horse limping, and I'd know the thing nobody around me knew, and I'd have to decide what to do with that knowledge. And you'd stop, I said. And I'd stop, he said, every time. Before I left, one of the dogs, a blue heeler named Salt that had been the harder of the two to reach, came out of the barn and sat near the fire. Not close, not comfortable, but out. She sat at the edge of the firelight's reach and looked at it, and at us, and then looked away toward the dark in the direction of the cattle fields, which were quiet and smelled of alfalfa and the particular night smell of the high desert in June. Tomás glanced at her once and then back at the fire. He didn't make the sound, he didn't do anything. He just let her be there. After a while, she put her head down on her paws. She didn't sleep, her ears kept moving, monitoring, but she was down. She was present. She was choosing to be near the fire rather than against the back wall of the barn. I looked at Tomás. He was already looking at me. He didn't say anything. I opened my journal. I wrote Salt came out tonight. Tomás didn't do anything. That was the thing. He didn't do anything except be there, patient, without fear, and she came because the option existed. I paused. I wrote, I think that's all any of them need. The option. Someone who doesn't need anything from them. Someone who will be patient long enough for them to decide. I paused again. Then I wrote smaller. I'm going to think about how much of my life I've spent waiting for something to be ready before I stayed. I've been back to Dell's ranch twice since that September. Perdición is, by all accounts, the bull Dell hoped he'd be when he bought him, steady, healthy, useful. Gutierrez told me last fall that he'd forgotten what the animal was like in those first weeks. You know how it is, he said. You can't hold on to the before very well once the after arrives. I told him I'd written the before down. He looked at me with the expression people have when they realize that someone has been paying attention to them without their knowledge. Not alarmed, just adjusting. What did you write? He asked. Everything I could, I said. He nodded. That's good, he said. Someone should. Tomás called me in August, this August, a few weeks ago, to tell me that the young stallion at Clifford's place had been named. What did he name him? I asked. Empieza, Tomás said. Clifford named him. Empieza, Spanish for beginning, or it starts, depending on context and conjugation and the weight you put on it. That's a good name, I said. It's the right name, Tomás said. He came out of the stall yesterday and walked to the middle of the barn and just stood there, like he was announcing something. I laughed, and it felt the way it had felt that November in the truck, lighter than the conversation I'd expected to be having, lighter than I'd expected to feel. Are you writing it down? Tomás asked. Always, I said. A pause. Good, he said. That's good. There's a last thing, and then I'll stop, because some things need to end before you're finished with them to remain honest. Last fall, the fall after the gathering, so about 13 months ago, I was at a rodeo in Espanola for broker reasons, and I watched a bull get run in the arena that was, to my eye, the wrong kind of nervous. Not injured, not panicked, wrong nervous in a more domestic way. The low-grade anxiety of an animal that had been managed well but crowded too often, that needed more space than it was getting. Nobody else seemed to see it. The handlers were competent, the crowd was attentive, the bull did what the bull was supposed to do. But I saw it. I wrote it in my journal afterward. The specific quality of it, what it looked like, what it signaled about the animal's state. I filed it the way Tomás had taught me to file things, not as a story with a lesson at the end, but as data, as part of the larger picture that you're always only partially seeing. I don't know what happened to that bull after the rodeo. I don't know if anyone else noticed what I noticed, or if the nervousness resolved on its own, or if it compounded into something worse. But I know I saw it. And knowing I saw it changed what I did, which was nothing visible. I didn't intervene, didn't have the context or the relationship to intervene, didn't know enough about that operation to say anything useful. But I watched more carefully for the rest of the afternoon. I paid attention in a way I wouldn't have paid attention 13 months prior. That's a small thing. It might be the smallest possible version of what Tomás demonstrated in that arena. But it's the version I have, and I've learned from him that you work with what you have, and you do it for as long as the situation requires, and your hands shake afterward if they need to, and that's okay.